In the suffocating heat of 1893, when justice turned its face away and hatred rode openly through the streets, one woman became a shadow that struck back. They called her a witch, a specter, a devil dressed in darkness who delivered vengeance the courts refused to serve. But this was no ordinary avenger. This was a ghost forged in the crucible of loss. A black woman who hunted those who believed themselves untouchable. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from the comments. Now, let's journey back to 1893 to a town in Mississippi where terror wore white and a legend was born from grief and fury. The July sun hung like a furnace in the Mississippi sky, baking the red clay roads until they cracked like old leather. Clara Freeman, a woman of 32 years, guided her buckboard wagon into the town of Mercy Falls, a name that had become a cruel jest in recent months. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of a teacher, which is precisely what she had been before the world caught fire. Her back was straight, her hands steady on the reins, but her eyes, those dark, watchful eyes, never stopped moving. They scanned every shadowed doorway, every alley, every face that turned her way. She remembered Mercy Falls as a place of possibility. After the war, it had been one of those rare towns where freed people could actually build something. There had been a school, a church with a real bell, businesses run by colored folks who owned the very ground beneath their feet. The town she entered now was a graveyard of those dreams. The school where she had taught, where children's laughter once filled the air, was a blackened shell. Its windows empty, eye sockets staring at nothing. The streets were eerily quiet, the few people she saw moving quickly, heads down, as if afraid the very air might strike them. Her destination was a small cabin on the edge of town, the home of Reverend Thomas, an elderly man who had been her father's closest friend. As she approached, her heart constricted. The garden that had once been his pride was trampled and ruined. A crude cross, burned into the dirt of his yard, scarred the earth like a brand. The Reverend emerged as she climbed down from the wagon, his face breaking into a smile that couldn't quite reach his haunted eyes. "Clara, child," he breathed, embracing her with trembling arms. "You shouldn't have come back. This place, it ain't safe anymore." "I had to come, Reverend," Clara said softly, though her voice carried an edge of steel. "When I heard about Mama and Papa, about what happened, I had to come." The old man's face crumpled, and he pulled her inside, away from the watching windows and the oppressive heat. In the dim coolness of his cabin, he told her what the telegram could not. How the night riders had come 3 weeks ago. How her parents, respected members of the community, had been dragged from their home simply because her father had dared to register to vote. How they had been beaten, their house burned, and how her father had died from his injuries 2 days later. Her mother, broken by grief and terror, had followed him within a week. "They call themselves the White Knights," Reverend Thomas whispered, his hands shaking as he poured her water. "They're worse than the old clan, Clara. More organized, more vicious. They got themselves a leader, a man named Whitmore. He's a judge by day, but by night." He couldn't finish the sentence. Clara sat perfectly still, absorbing the words like body blows. The grief was a physical thing, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. But beneath the grief, something else was kindling. Something cold and sharp and absolutely unyielding. That night, she lay awake in the Reverend's spare room, staring at the ceiling while the sounds of distant screams and the orange glow of another burning filled the darkness. She rose and walked to the window, watching the horizon pulse with flame. She was a teacher. She had believed in books, in education, in the slow, patient work of building a better world. But her parents, who had believed the same, were dead. And the law, The courts, the very institutions that were supposed to protect them, were run by the men in hoods. If she could not teach the future, she would avenge the past. From beneath her traveling cloak, she pulled a small wooden box. Inside were the last remnants of a life she had lived before teaching, a life she had tried to forget. Before the war ended, before she had picked up a primer and slate, Clara had been a scout for the Union Army. Not officially, of course. Women were not recognized. But in the chaos of war, information was currency, and she had been very, very good at gathering it. She had moved through Confederate lines like smoke, had learned to read the land, to track men, to disappear. She laid out the contents of the box on the narrow bed. A well-maintained Colt revolver, its weight familiar in her hand. A hunting knife with a blade that still held its edge. A coil of thin, strong rope. And a leather journal, its pages filled with observations, tactics, and the cold calculus of survival. She opened the journal to a fresh page and wrote in her precise, careful hand, July 15th, 1893. Returned to Mercy Falls to bury my dead, and found a town buried alive. The law has become the lawless. If they hunt in white, then darkness will hunt them. The transformation took 3 days of careful, methodical work. Clara moved like a ghost through the abandoned buildings at the edge of town, scavenging what she needed. From the ruins of the old dry goods store, she salvaged bolts of black fabric, heavy canvas that she could fashion into riding clothes. She worked by candlelight in an abandoned tobacco barn, her needle moving with the precision of her teacher's hand, but stitching a different kind of lesson. She dyed everything with a mixture of soot and indigo until it drank the darkness and became one with the night. The pants, the shirt, the long coat that would move like wings when she rode. From a piece of soft black leather, saved from an old doctor's bag, she cut and shaped a mask. Not the crude sack of the night riders, but something that covered her entire face, with narrow slits for eyes and small holes that would let her breathe. She tested it repeatedly, ensuring it would not slip, would not reveal. Her horse was a challenge. She could not use her own mare, too recognizable. But on the third night, she made her way to the paddock of a wealthy white landowner who bred horses for racing. There, in the darkness, she found what she needed, a black mare with intelligent eyes and a powerful build. She did not steal the horse. She borrowed it, she told herself, though she knew she would never return it. She named her Shadow. For days, she trained in secret, teaching Shadow to respond to the slightest pressure of her knees, the softest click of her tongue. She taught the horse to stand motionless in the dark, to move through brush without sound. She wrapped the saddle and bridle in cloth, eliminating any jingle or creak that might betray them. The intelligence came from an unexpected source. A young white woman named Margaret, the daughter of a shopkeeper, who had watched Clara teach before the school burned. Margaret had been one of the few white children whose parents had allowed her to learn alongside the colored children, and she had loved Clara like a second mother. Now, filled with shame at what her town had become, she sought Clara out in secret. "They're planning to ride again," Margaret whispered, meeting Clara in the shadows behind her father's store. "Tomorrow night. They're going after the Johnson family because Mr. Johnson refused to sell his land to Judge Whitmore." Her voice broke. "Miss Clara, they're going to kill them." Clara placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "How do you know this?" "My father. He's not one of them, but he hears things. They gather at the old grist mill before they ride. That's where they put on their robes." Margaret's eyes were bright with tears. "Can you stop them?" "I don't know," Clara said honestly, "but I'm going to try." The night was moonless, a perfect canvas of darkness. Clara, dressed in her black garments and masked, rode Shadow toward the old grist mill. She could hear them before she could see them, their voices carrying on the still air, loud with the false courage of men who believe themselves invincible. She counted 12 of them, their white robes ghostly in the lamplight, their horses restless and stamping. She did not attack directly. That would be suicide. Instead, she studied the terrain, her scout's mind cataloging every advantage. The mill sat beside a creek, the water wheel long since rotted away. The building itself was unstable, its timbers weakened by years of neglect. And all around it, the thick Mississippi undergrowth provided perfect cover. She worked quickly and silently. Using her rope, she created a series of trip lines across the path the riders would have to take, positioning them at exactly the height to catch a horse's legs. She gathered dry branches and positioned them in the undergrowth, creating obstacles that would force the riders off the main path and into narrower, more treacherous ground. And then she waited. When the riders emerged from the mill, transformed into their white-robed personas, she struck, not with violence, but with fear. She had learned, in her time as a scout, that the most effective weapon was often the enemy's own imagination. She began with sounds, throwing her voice the way she had learned as a child, creating echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The cry of a panther, the scream of a woman, the deep, resonant moan of wind through a hollow tree. The horses, already nervous, began to shy and dance. Then she appeared, not charging from the darkness, but materializing from it. Shadow moved like liquid night, and Clara sat astride her like a dark angel of judgment. In her hand, she held not a gun, but a whip, the crack of it like thunder in the night. The first rider went down when his horse hit one of her trip lines, the man tumbling into the mud with a cry of shock. Another veered off the path and crashed into the undergrowth, his robe catching on thorns and branches. The whip cracked again, and a torch went flying, its flame extinguished in the creek. Throughout the chaos, Clara said nothing. Her silence was more terrifying than any scream. These men were used to the sounds of terror from their victims. They were not prepared for an enemy who struck without warning, without sound, without mercy. She did not kill. She unhorsed. She disarmed. She left them scattered and confused, their white robes muddy and torn, their confidence shattered. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving behind only the thunder of hoofbeats fading into the night. By morning, the story had spread through both communities. Among the black residents, it was told in hushed, wondering tones, a dark rider who had descended upon the clan like judgment itself. In the white community, the defeated riders, unable to admit they had been routed by a single person, spun tales of demons and witchcraft, of unnatural forces protecting the colored folk. Judge Whitmore heard the stories in his chambers, his face flushing with rage. He was a man who had built his power on fear, and now his own men were afraid. That could not stand. He called a secret meeting of his inner circle, the hardcore believers who would never break. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cold and measured, "we have a problem. This phantom, this creature, has made us look like fools. Our authority has been questioned. Our power has been mocked." He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "We will set a trap. We will announce, loudly, that we are riding against the Freedmen's Church. We will make sure this information reaches the right ears. And when our dark rider comes to save the faithful, we will be waiting, not in white robes, but in the shadows. We will end this legend before it takes root." The trap was elaborate. Margaret, unaware she was being used, overheard the plan and dutifully reported it to Clara. But Clara, her instincts honed by years of survival, smelled the deception. The announcement was too loud, too public. Whitmore was too intelligent to repeat the same mistakes. She did not ride to the church. Instead, She moved on foot through the darkness, using every skill she had learned as a scout. She approached the church from downwind, moving through the palmetto and Spanish moss like a ghost. And there, in the darkness, she saw them. Not white-robed riders, but men dressed in dark clothing, hiding in the trees, behind gravestones, in the church's bell tower. 24 at least, all armed, all waiting for a rider who would never come. Clara's blood ran cold. If she had ridden in as the Phantom, she would have been cut down in seconds. But she had not. She had listened to the voice of caution that had kept her alive through a war. Now she had to decide: disappear and let them think the Phantom was afraid, or turn their trap into theirs undoing. She chose the latter. She circled wide, moving miles through the darkness to reach Judge Whitmore's plantation home, a grand antebellum mansion that stood as a monument to old power trying to reassert itself. Whitmore was at the church, commanding his trap. His home was guarded only by servants, all of whom were colored and all of whom had reasons to hate him. Clara approached the kitchen door and knocked softly. An elderly woman answered, her eyes going wide when she saw the masked figure before her. But Clara lifted her mask slightly, just enough for the woman to see her face. "Miss Clara," the woman whispered in shock. "I need your help." "Aunt Ruth," Clara said quietly, "I need you to wake everyone in the house and get them out. Far away. Can you do that?" The old woman looked at her for a long moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. Then she nodded. "Give me 10 minutes, child." While the servants fled into the night, Clara worked. She soaked the judge's study in lamp oil, his precious law books, his Confederate memorabilia, all his symbols of authority. She did the same in his grand parlor, his dining room. She was not destroying a home. She was burning a temple to hatred. When she was certain everyone was clear, she struck a match and dropped it. The flames caught and spread with terrifying speed, racing through the old wooden structure like a living thing. By the time she rode Shadow back toward the church, the sky behind her was glowing orange, a false dawn that could be seen for miles. The men waiting at the church saw it. Confusion erupted. That was the direction of Whitmore's home. The judge, seeing his empire burning, let out a roar of rage and commanded his men to ride. The trap was abandoned as they raced to save what they could of his property. Clara did not follow them. Instead, she rode to the church, where the congregation, warned by Margaret, had gathered in terrified confusion. She dismounted and approached the door, pulling a piece of paper from her coat. On it, in her careful teacher's hand, she had written a list. Every name of every man who rode with the Klan, every crime they had committed, every family they had destroyed. She nailed the paper to the church door with her knife. A public declaration, an accounting. Then she rode away before anyone could stop her, the sound of Shadow's hooves echoing through the night like a promise. Judge Whitmore's authority crumbled like his burned mansion. The list Clara had posted was copied and distributed throughout the county. Federal investigators, finally motivated by such public exposure, arrived from Jackson. Some men fled. Others were arrested. Whitmore himself was driven from his position, his power broken as thoroughly as his home. The night ride stopped. Slowly, painfully, Mercy Falls began to heal. Clara Freeman was never seen in the town again. The Phantom Rider, her purpose fulfilled, disappeared like morning mist. Some said she had gone north, perhaps to teach in a place where her students would not be burned alive for learning. Others claimed she had died in the fire at Whitmore's mansion, a martyr to the cause. But on quiet summer nights, when the air is thick and heavy and storms gather on the horizon, old folks in Mississippi still tell stories of a dark rider on a darker horse. A woman who wore a mask to fight those who hid behind them. A teacher who taught the most important lesson of all, that evil, when it believes itself invincible, is at its most vulnerable. Years later, when the church was finally being renovated, workers found something hidden in a crevice beneath the floorboards. A leather journal, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Most of the pages were filled with observations about teaching, about students, about hope for the future. But the last entry, written in a strong, clear hand, read simply, "They wore white to hide their faces. I wore black to hide mine." The difference was in what we were hiding from. They feared exposure. I feared failure. They wanted to preserve the past. I fought for the future. Let this be my testimony. When monsters wear masks, sometimes an angel must wear one too. The story ends, but the legend lives on. And sometimes, in the deep Mississippi night, when injustice seems to have won and hope feels like a luxury no one can afford, people swear they can hear it. The distant sound of hoofbeats, steady and sure, a reminder that darkness can be fought with darkness, and that one person, armed with courage and fury, can change the world.